All right. Good morning, everybody. All right. We're on Daf Kuf Aleph is today's Daf. We got to the top Mishnah, Mesechus Eruvin. So let's plug away. So Masnisa Mishnah says, Hadelas she b'muksa v'chadokim she b'pirtza. So if you have a door, right, in a muksa. Muksa is something, right, which is basically something that's not typically used. It's not basically a functional door. It might be like a back storage house or something like that. Or you also have, you say, chadakim, or you take thorns and you put it in basically to plug up a large hole in a fence, barbed wire or thorns, right? So these are basically doors that are not functional, they're not used often, that are basically to sort of, keep the hole or the gap plugged for long periods of time, machzelas, or with mats to plug up this hole. You can't go ahead and use them to go ahead and you can't open and close them on Shabbos. Why? Because it appears that it's similar to Baina. As a person it's like his building. Why? Because this is something on the ground that it seems like he's basically closing up a structure, since it's not necessarily a door, right? It's not a door that opens and closes. It doesn't really have a pivot that opens and closes, as we'll soon see in the Gemara. So this is something which is more like a permanent thing, right? You take, let's say, like a board of plywood, right? And you stick it, to close up. So it's not meant to open and close. So since it's not a door, it's more of constructing a wall. Therefore, it is forbidden unless it's hanging. It's suspended in the air. If it's suspended in the air, then it's not considered to be building because it's not on the ground. You're not building the ground, because since it's off the ground, then you see it's not part of a permanent structure. So that was the Mishnah. Let's see the Gemara. I've Raminu asked you a kasha. Delas hanigrares, maktalas hanigrares, v'kankon hanigra. So if you have basically a door, right, that basically that's nigrar, that drags on the ground, or a reed mat that drags on the ground, or a kankana hanigrar, or you also have some sort of plow, right, that drags bismanchek shurin v'taluyin nolim behem b'Shabbos. If they're tied, right, to, let's say, to the wall. Now, as these doors are attached, right, and they're hanging from it, noalim behem b'Shabbos, the ein tzarich lamar b'yantif, right? Then you can go ahead and open and close it on Shabbos, and certainly on Yantif. Why? So what do you see from here? There is no requirement to be suspended in the air, right? Even as long as it's, let's say, tied with a rope to the wall. So therefore, this thing that's plugging up, whether it's a door, whatever it is, plugging up, right, is not considered, as long as it's attached, right? And then opening and closing, it doesn't have to be suspended in the air. It's not considered to be bona. Abaye says, no, that case over there, we're talking about what has a pivot. Since it's a pivot, right? A pivot is basically, there's like a pin, and a door is attached to the pin and opens and closes, right? So since that has a pivot, right, therefore that's considered to be a door, as opposed to like a large piece of wood or just something which is, pushed up into that space. That would be different. Rav Amar Shahaylan's here. Rabbi says, even though it doesn't have a tzir now, it doesn't have a pivot now, but if it had a pivot, then it shows that it's more of a temporary door. It's a door that's used to open and close, and not necessarily a wall that's being constructed. So the same case, a door, a reed mat, or a plow that was dragging. It says they're beferish. If they're attached, right, and they're to the wall, to the structure, and they're raised from the ground, even, right, a hair, even a small amount, noalin behen, then you can go ahead and use it. So we see over here how could Abaye and Rabba say, as long as it has as long as over there, right, if it's attached, then you can open and close it, and there's no requirement of being elevated from the ground. And here we see it has to be elevated somewhat from the ground. If not, you can't go ahead and close them up. So Abaye mitaras atame, Rava mitaras atame. So no, Abaye and Rava will each give their own terusim to answer, to defend themselves. Abaye mitaras atame. So Abaye says, no, this is how you read it. Oshi yesh lehen sir, oshi go aretz. It's either or. Either it's suspended in the air, or it has a pivot. In other words, but if it has a pivot, it doesn't have to be suspended in the air. So no, according to Abaye, it's not a kasha. And Rava Mataratz Atame, Rava said the same thing. Right? When at least at one point it had a pivot. If once it had a pivot, even if it's not off the ground, then it's okay. Or if it's off the ground and it doesn't have a pivot or never had a pivot, then it's okay because it's suspended from the air and it does not appear to be a person involved in baina. So Taner Rabbanan, speaking of different partitions, so Seiche Kaitzim, right? You have a big, like I say, a bush, a thorn bush, the Chavilin, Shehiksin appears or you have bundles that you go ahead and you basically stuff it into a hole in the fence, right? Or in the to the Chatzer. If they're tied and attached to the fence, to the wall next to it, then you can go ahead and plug it in. Then you can go ahead and lock it up on Shabbos. So they can do it on Yontif, but if it's not, then it sounds like it would be forbidden. And Tane Reb Chia, Deles Almana Hanigreres Ein Nolin Ba. If you have a Deles Almana, right, just like it sounds, Almana is a widow, right? So a widowed door, Nigreres that's on the ground, you can't go ahead and use it because then it's near a Kabaina. So Heichidam Delas Almana. What does this mean? What's a Delas Almana, right? So right. What does it mean? A widowed door. So Yikadamri, the Chad Shifa. Once it's a single board, right? It's one board like a piece of plywood, right? A piece of plywood that's called, it's like a widowed board, right? Or I don't know, a poor man's board, right? It's something which is simple, and therefore it's not a real door, and therefore that appears more like a wall. And Yikadamri, the less like Yishma, right? There is no sort of crossbeam that comes on top. Right. In other words, even if it's multiple boards, but they're just attached here and there's no sort of frame to it, that's also considered to be not necessarily a door, because a door one is allowed to open and close. But if it's a wall, you can't go ahead and open and close it because that is more of an act of baina. And Amar Rav Yehuda, Hi Medursa. So speaking of this Medursa, right, like a Medura, right, a bonfire. So mimalo lamata shari. If you're going to ahead, let's say on Yontif or something, right? We have the same prohibition when it comes to building on Shabbos as we do on Yontif. So if one is going ahead, let's say building, he's taking his logs and he's going ahead and build it. However, you have to build it from top to the bottom. If you go ahead and you hold up what's going to be on top and then you put the other logs underneath it, that's okay. However, if you go ahead and construct on the bottom and then you put on top, that is near a kabaina. That's similar to being a baina, to building. You can't build this bonfire. V'chein biyasa, so to an egg. I guess you're roasting an egg on top of an area. Right, to go ahead and basically put the eggs on coals, right, on top of a metal grade. Right, so over there, so you want to go ahead and put on wood, so you have to hold that up first, and then put the stuff underneath it, as opposed to building on top and then putting the eggs on top. So to a pot, you're putting the pot. You shouldn't go ahead and build underneath, then place the pot on top. Rather, have the pot there and then come underneath, because this is not the normal way of building. And so too by a bed, when constructing a bed that they used to go ahead and construct and deconstruct every day, or right. And also a barrel, you're going ahead and piling up barrels, right? You have to have that on top and then place the sides underneath it, as opposed to building up, because that is once again near Rekabaina. Speaking of using thorns to go ahead and plug up walls, right? Brings us to this next case. Amar le'ahut Saduki Rabbi Shua ben Chananya. One time a certain Saduki said to Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, says, Chidka. He says, oh, Mr. Thorny One, right? Chidka. Right? It says, by you guys, right? The best ones are thorns, right? And that doesn't sound like a good thing, right? Your tzaddikim are thorns, right? It says in your pasuk, pasuk in Micha. So Amalei, it says Shatia, right? The Shaita, right? Shafil Seif the Kra, right? Look at the end of the pasuk. Dichsiv Yasher Misecha, right? The Yasher ones, the upright, the straight ones, those are better than a shelter, than a sukkah. If that's the case, the whole pasuk is shevach. It's not gnai. It's not bad thing to be called thorns. It's actually good things. So now, because the end of the pasuk says the good ones are like shelter. So what does the beginning of the pasuk means, right? That the Talmid Chachamim are like thorns. It says that just like thorns can go ahead and protect a hole in the wall, right? You have a hole in the fence, you go ahead and you put thorns there, people will stop animals or people from going through. So too, the thorn ones protect, right, the Talmid Chachamim protect Bnei Yisrael. And Davar Acher, Toivam kechedek, right? It says toivam kechedek. So Shema Hadikin as a Rashayim the Gehenna. It doesn't mean chedek, it really means hedek, right? It doesn't mean thorn, it means to crush, right? In other words, that they will go ahead and crush the Rashayim to Gehenna. Shinamar Zapasik. It says, Kumi, the Daishi, right? Get up and the Daishi and thresh. Basiyan ki karnech asim barzel persesecha asim nechusha v'haidokas amim rapim. Says over there, the Bnei Yisrael, because right your horn will be made of metal, right? And then I will put nechayshas right on your hooves, and then you will crush all the other nations. So you see that the tzaddikim will crush the other ones, and basically, Mr. Tzeduki, this is not a bad thing against the Jews, rather a good thing against Talmidei Chachamim. Fine. Now your Mishnah. Mishnah says, now you have to go ahead and remember. We have a discussion, right? At the beginning of the parak, we had two different Mishnayos. It was Machlokes between Rav Meir and Chachamim, which will basically continue in this, as to whether one is permitted to stand in a different rishus and use something right in a different rishus. So says the Mishnah, Lo yamod adam b'rishus hayachid v'yiftach b'rishus harabim. A person should not go ahead and stand in rishus hayachid and basically use a key in the rishus harabim to unlock something in rishus harabim. Why? Because he might go ahead and bring the key to where he's standing, which is in the rishus hayachid, and then the lock is in the rishus harabim, or vice versa. Right? Rishus harabim, you can't stand in rishus harabim v'yiftach b'rishus hayachid and stand in rishus hayachid elim kain, but only if asa mechitza gvasar tefachim. In the last case, if he stands as a rabbim and he wants to go ahead and handle a key in the Shus Yachid to unlock it, to unlock the lock in the Shus Yachid, he can't do it unless there's a mechitza around him of 10 tefachim, because then he's no longer in a Rishus Rabbim. He's like in a Rishus Yachid, and therefore it'd be Rishus Yachid to Rishus Yachid, which would be mutter because they wouldn't be subject to a chatas. Divi Rameir. There's a opinion of Rameir, which we've seen all along, that one is not really should not manipulate something in a different rishus where he's at, because he might go ahead and bring it to where he's at. Amru lo. So the Chachamim said the back to Rameir. Ma'isa b'shuk shel ptamim. One time there was a mice in the shuk of the butchers. Shayu b'shalayim shayu noelim manechem es mafteach b'choloin she'al gabi Pesach. They used to go ahead and leave the key. They're the keys to the shops, right, in the windows, right next to the entrance. And so they would leave him up there on top, which l'chayra was the Rishus. There was outside the Rishus Rabbim, and they left it there in the Rishus HaYachid, and they used to do it. And Rabbi Yossi just argues on technicality. He says, no, that might occur in the shuk of the Ptamim of the butchers, rather the shuk shel tzmar hayu, right? It was of the local merchants. So that was the case over there, but you see that one was able to go ahead and basically open locks, which are the lock was in the Rishus Yachid. It was in the door of the private owned shops, and the key, and they were standing in the Rishus Rabbim. So you see that you are allowed to stand in Rishus Rabbim and use a key in the Rishus HaYachid. So that was the kasha. That was the conversation between Rameir stated halacha, the Rabbanan asked him. So now, first, the Rabbanan. I understand you, Rabbanan. So the Gemara says, the Rabbanan, Alma Rabbi Meir Rishus Harabim Umahadina Iyu B'Karmelis. Rabbi Meir was talking, right? He mentioned over there, he's talking about Rishus Harabim, and you ask a question, this marketplace, from a Carmelis, right? What do you mean? Why is it a Carmelis, right? Because this Maisa was in Yerushalayim. Damar Rabbi Rechan, Amar Rabbi Yechon, Yerushalayim Imlei Delasanus B'Laylo Chayvin Aleh Mishum Rishus Harabim. If it wasn't for the fact that Yerushalayim was closed up in the evenings because of the wall around the city, and there were doors there they used to close at night, one would be chayiv for carrying in there, because it would be Rishus Harabim. But since there are doors that lock at night in Yerushalayim is not for sale, right? And Yerushalayim is also not a Rishus Harabim, right? It's a Carmelis, right? Yerushalayim is a Carmelis because it has doors that open and close in the evenings, right? And since they close off, it's a Carmelis. So your kasha of standing in a Rishus Harabim and using a key in a Rishus Yachid is not a kasha, because they weren't standing in Rishus Harabim, they were standing in a Carmelis. Now maybe it's like this. In the beginning, when the halacha was set over there by Yerushalayim, that was when the walls were standing and they had doors they used to open and close at night. But after that, the destruction, and after there were no longer walls, right, or doors that open and closed, then is no longer a Carmelis, because now it doesn't have this open and closing of the nightly of the doors. So rather, it's considered to be Rishus Harabim, and that was the kasha over there. So okay, so it's a good kasha on Rab Meir. So now it's a Rab Omar. So Rab says Seifa Asan L'Sharigina. Right. So he says no. The Seifa actually was referring to the case of Sharigina, which we're going to see in a little bit. These are considered basically to be these were not the gates of a garden of a gina. Right. So now Rab Meir's halacha wasn't that one can stand in the Rishus Harabim and then use that one can't go ahead and stand in Rishus Harabim and use a key in Rishus Yachid, right? Rather, it was talking about it was a case of a Carmelis. It was a case of a Carmelis, and therefore the Hachi Kamar. This means to say V'chein lo yamad Rishus Yachid v'yiftach b'Carmelis. So too, a person shouldn't stand in Rishus Yachid and open something in a Carmelis, not in a Rishus Harabim, rather in a Carmelis, or Carmelis. He shouldn't stand in a Carmelis and the Yiftach Rishus Yachid and then use the key Rishus Yachid. So it's not only he didn't say his halacha when it came to Rishus Harabim. He said his halacha by case of the Carmelis, right? So Elim Kain also mechitza gavo asara tfachim direme. Unless he goes ahead, he can't stand in a Carmelis and open a key in a Rishus Yachid, right? Unless he makes a wall around himself to make himself in a Rishus Yachid. Therefore, it's Rishus Yachid to Rishus Yachid, not a Carmelis to Rishus Yachid. And then on that, Amrulo, and on that they said to him, right? And on that, if you're talking about a Carmelis, what do I mean? I'll bring you a question from from that which they said in Yerushalayim, right? That they used to go ahead and leave the keys there, right? And then leave it in the window, right? Shagai Pesach and Rabbi Yisrael. So it was the marketplace of merchants. It wasn't the marketplace of butchers, but nevertheless, point well taken that we see that they used to go ahead and stand in a Carmelis and then use keys in a Rishus HaYachid. Now, we have to remember that the lock box or this lock, right? Now, if you have a large lock, right? Let's say it's large, it's 4x4 tefachim, right? Which is not that big, 20 inches by 20 inches or so, or 24 by 24, 2 feet by 2 feet. And if it's elevated, right? Anything that's 4x4 and elevated 10 tefachim is a Rishus HaYachid, is its own Rishus HaYachid, right? Even if it's within a Rishus Harabim, if it's its own entity in a Rishus Harabim, right? But since it's 10 tefachim tall and 4x4, it's considered to be a Rishus HaYachid. Now, if it's 4x4 but below 10 tefachim, it's a Carmelis, okay? And if it's above 10 tefachim, but not 4x4, it's a Mokum Patur. All right, so with that in mind, let's go on to the two dots. So Tana Rabbanan, we are 5 lines from the top on Kuf Aleph Amud Beis. So Tana Rabbanan, Pische Sharigina. So you have the doors or the openings, the locks of a Sharigina, right? Of the gate to the ginas, these gardens, right? These gardens were not Rishus HaYachid. They were Besasayim. They were considered to be, it wasn't the hook of the dira, so therefore it's considered to be a Carmelis. So you have the entranceway to a Sharigina. Bisman sheyesh lahen beis sham bifnim. So if you have on the inside, now let's say you have a small little vestibule. So in other words, basically you have an entranceway, huge garden, right? And within right in front of the door, there's basically partitions right around the door. So if you have, partitions right around the door, so that area is a Rishus HaYachid. So B'zman sheyesh lahen beis sham bifnim, pasech v'noel mibifnim. Then you can go ahead, right, and basically use the key, right? And he can go ahead and use the key because this key was something which was, let me just see, Rashi. Rashi doesn't say that, fine. All right, so we say over here that, right, Sharigina, just the second line, the second line of Rashi, right? Sharigina, right? But the gates of the Gina says Stan Munoleam, right? I'm just reading the Rashi, right? Their locks, Gavoy and Asara, were 10 tefachim off the ground, the Rachban Arba, right? And were 4 tefachim wide, Rishus HaYachid, and they were considered to be Rishus HaYachid, okay? Now, going back, so if you have walls inside the fence, right? And the walls are an area of more than 4x4, and the lock itself, right, is 4x4 more than 10 tefachim off the ground. So you're in a Rishus HaYachid, and you're, using a lock and key in Rishus HaYachid, that would be mutter. Now, then you're allowed to be. So you'd be able to go ahead and lock and unlock while standing inside. But now, however, you can't do it from the outside because the outside is Rishus Harabim. And if you have the area around the gate where the lock is, but that the enclosed area is right outside the fence and the outside of the fence, then you go ahead and open and unclose from the outside, because on the outside is right outside there is a little enclosed area which is Rishus Yachid to the lock, which is Rishus Yachid. And then mikan, if you have, let's say there's like vestibules or enclosed areas on both sides of the doorway, right? Then you can go ahead and use both. And if you don't have on either side, right, there's no those areas, you just have the lock, then the lock itself is considered to be a Rishus Yachid. Outside is Rishus Harabim, right? Inside is a Carmelis, so neither one can go ahead and use the lock, which is a Rishus HaYachid, a certain Kamakan. Both of them are Asr. So too, the same should apply with stores, right? With shops that open into the Rishus Harabim. So let's think about it, right? So now it's going to go through. If during the time when this lock is below 10, so as we said before, anything, right, the lock is 4x4, right? Assuming it's 4x4. So if the lock is 4x4 and it's below 10, that's a Carmelis. So you can go ahead and bring the key from before Shabbos. You can go ahead and leave it on the threshold right at the bottom there, which is also a Carmelis because it's not 10 tefachim tall. So you can go ahead and leave it on the Carmelis, right? And the next day you can go ahead and lock from the threshold to this to the lock, because the lock is below 10, so it's Carmelis to Carmelis, which would be okay. However, if the lock is not below 10 where it's a Carmelis, rather above, which is now a Rishus HaYachid, and therefore now the Skufa was still a Carmelis, so it'll be this Carmelis to Rishus HaYachid. So what does he do then? He has to go ahead and take the key. He can't leave it on the Skufa. The Skufa is a Carmelis, and you go from a Carmelis to a Rishus HaYachid, right? So what do? You leave the key on the lock, right? So now as you leave the key on the Rishus HaYachid and you use it in the same Rishus HaYachid, the next day you can go ahead and lock it, unlock it, and put it back in its place by the lock. No, af bisman. Now, we're going to point out later on that even though you're standing, right, in the Rishus Harabim, right, and the key is on the lock, right, which is a Rishus Yachid, and the lock itself is Rishus Yachid, you're allowed to go ahead and use it, right? This is going to be different than the Rav Meir we previously saw, because remember, Rav Meir previously saw says if you're standing in Rishus Harabim, you can't go ahead and move things in a Rishus Yachid. But we're going to get to that later on. I just wanted to point that out here. So when we point later on that Rav Meir's chayzer, we see over here. But anyways, Rav Meir says you can go ahead and leave the key on the lock. You just can't put on the skufa. Even if the lock is above 10, making it a Rishus Yachid. Maybe Maftech Me'er Shabbos, Manicha be Skufa, you can go ahead and leave the key on Erev Shabbos, leave it on the threshold on the bottom. The next day you can go ahead and lock it, unlock it, and then put it back on the Skufa. Or in a window, right, that's by the Skufa, I guess a window by the area, which is the window sill is not considered to be 4x4, and therefore that's a makom patur. Also, you can leave the key in a makom patur or the Carmelis according to the Chamim. And arba. However, if by the chalon is 4x4, right, then it'll be aser because that's what Rishus Yachid. Because then he would move from the Rishus, right? He can't go ahead and take it from the Carmelis and put it to the to Rishus Yachid, right? Because that would be from one Rishus to the other. Now. So we had the first case. We said this is the story when it comes to that was a long brisa, right? It started 5 lines from the top, right? Now, the first case was talking about a lock by Sharagina, right? Depending if there's walls around either side of the door, and then we had that was the case A was with the Sharagina, and the case B was with the shops. So we said v'chein b'chanios. Right? We said so too b'chanios. Michlal the viskupas karmos askina. Right. So since over there we're talking about the chanios, right, must be similar to the case of shargina. So therefore it must be that the iskufa is a karmos, right? Now, so hi mino heichi dami. So now the lock, right? What are we talking about? So either lesbe arba makom patur. If we're talking about the lock is not 4x4. Now we never really identified the size of the lock, right? And also in the case of the shop. So if, when I explained it, right, I assumed they were talking about a similar lock, but now we analyze it. So either lesle arba, if we're talking about the lock, which is more than 10 tfachim off the ground, but is less than 4x4, that's a makom patur. That's considered to be a makom patur. Right, and then that would be mutter. That'd not be aser, right? Because he would only aser if it was rishus yachid. But he is be'arba. But if it's a case of 4x4 and it's more than 10 off the ground, therefore it's a rishus yachid. Bahal lema rabbanan. So in this case, would the rabban, right? Would they have said af bizman shamino lamal me'asar maybe maftech me'er shas menich be'askufa l'machal pasach v'noyel bo u'machzil askufa o l'cholon shal gabi pesach? Would they have said that you can go ahead and leave the key on the skufa and then come the next day and lock it up and then move it back? Right? When you're moving it, right, then it's one thing if it's in a karmelis and you're moving it around in a karmelis, or if you're Rishus Harabim and you're moving a key around in the Rishus Hayachid and then you leave it there. But over here, right, we're talking about taking the key, putting it in a Rishus Hayachid, then taking it back from Rishus Hayachid and putting it in a karmelis, right? The Chachamim don't matter that. They only matter if you're standing in one Rishus and using it in another Rishus. But they don't allow you to go ahead and move it from one Rishus to the other, even if it's not a deraisa, even if it's just Rishus Yachid to a karmelis, that's still aser. So if we're talking about a lock where the lock itself is Rishus Yachid because it's 4x4 and 10 tefachim off the ground, Chachamim would never have given you the advice of leave the key and the karmelis, move it to Rishus Yachid, and then move it back to the karmelis. No, really, it is not 4x4. Therefore it's a makom patur. However, with the door and the lock itself, right, that the two of them together has a depth of 4 tefachim. So the lock itself is, let's say, only 3 tefachim, and the door, let's say, is 2 tefachim thick, right? So the combination of the two is 4x4. If it's 4x4, then it's like Rishus Yachid. But if you don't take into account, right, the door, right, then it's only 3 tefachim, it's makom patur. Therefore, it'll be a mutter, right? So basically, this is the machlokes over there. The Rameir Sover Chayking Lahashlim. Rameir says I don't mean magically, we halachically, right? We halachically basically carve out, we use the depth of the door can be included with the depth of the lock. And therefore, it's more than 4x4, and therefore that's considered to be Rishus Yachid. Therefore, Meir says Chayking, and therefore lahashlim to get the shear of 4x4, and therefore be aser. If Rabbanan Savri, however, the Rabbanan argue and say no, ein Chayking lahashlim lamaisa. The door is not carved out. Therefore, we have no obligation to go ahead and halachically carve out the door. And therefore, the lock is still considered a makom patur, and therefore be mutter to go ahead and move the key from the karmelis to the makom patur and back. And finally, because we're just going to stop at the Mishnah. So Amarav Bibi Barabaye Shmamina Mihal Masnisin Tlas. We can actually see 3 things, right, from this brisa. So first of all, Shmamida Chayking Lahashlim. Right. First of all, we see that one can be Chayking Lahashlim when it comes to Rav Meir. In other words, they use the area of the lock and the area of the door. You can combine them together to get a combination of 4x4 tefachim. Ushmami no hadarbe Rav Meir misharigina. We could also see that Rav Meir was chayzer, right, from his shita earlier, right? Because he said earlier, right, as I pointed out, that he was chayzer, and that he said in terms of a person standing in karmelis and moving something Rishus Yachid, we said that would be mutter. Ushmami no midrabanan east of Rav Meir, and also the Rav Dimi. We also know that which the Rabbanan say that they go like Rav Dimi. What does Rav Dimi say? Rav Dimi Rav Yochanan. Makom she'ein ba arba, a place which is not 4x4. Mutter lebnei Rishus Harabim lebnei Rishus Yachid. If it's a Makom P'tur, then people it's mutter to go ahead and who are either in Rosh Hashanah or in Rosh Hashanah, the Kativ allowed to go ahead and to basically use, to put something out there and take it back. In other words, you're allowed to go ahead and take it from Makom P'tur, from the Rosh Hashanah to Makom P'tur to Rosh Hashanah, or vice versa, like we had in the case of taking from the Carmelis to the lock, which is a Makom P'tur, and putting it back. However, on the condition that you don't basically go ahead and switch it. In other words, you can't basically take something from a Rosh Hashanah, put it in a Makom P'tur, and then take from the Makom P'tur to Shusay Yachid, right? You can only use it from that area and back, but you can't go through Makom P'tur to another Rishus. Right, we'll stop here at the Mishnah. Tomorrow, Mirz Hashem, will continue from here. Everyone should have a wonderful day and enjoy